Alright, welcome back. Here we continue where we left off. My last paragraph before the break was, if on the other hand it is proved that the company was totally reckless in erecting the tower and omitted vital safety procedures, then a breach of duty of care is the result and the company will be liable. So now, new paragraph. It is also necessary to establish that, firstly, damages or injuries were caused as a direct result, and you can underline this and put this in bold. It is necessary to establish that, firstly, damages or injuries were caused as a direct result of the careless act, and secondly, that such carelessness was reasonably foreseeable. Full stop. If the injury is foreseeable, the company will be liable for the full extent of the injuries. New paragraph. We've seen this one, direct result. Okay, so we see that if the injury caused was as a direct result of the carelessness of the company, then they will be liable for the full extent of the injuries. And secondly, such carelessness was reasonably foreseeable. In other words, these guys erecting the scaffolding tower, rushing off to lunch or home or because of snow or rain, they will know that they hadn't secured the tower properly. Bolts were missing, screws were missing, they were only perhaps a quarter of the way through. So they will know that to rush off and leave the tower in the way they left it was predictable, that somebody could be injured because a part of it could fall down. Any normal human being would know that. So that is the fact, the second fact, that their carelessness was foreseeable. It was foreseeable that their carelessness could injure someone, could cause someone to be injured. But they didn't care less. They went off to lunch anyway, or they went off because the weather was so bad. Okay? And the first thing is that their carelessness caused the injuries. It was as a direct result of their carelessness that the injuries were carried out. Alright, or the injuries happened. Good. New paragraph. If, however, the chain of events is broken by some independent or new act intervening between the careless act and the injuries then the law accepts So to repeat, if however the chain of events is broken by some independent or new act intervening between the carelessness and the injuries, then the law accepts that the damage will be too remote. Now this is referred to as remoteness of damage. Okay, so if the damage was too remote or there is remoteness of damage, it means that there was no direct result. In other words, you have the carelessness and you have the injuries. Nothing intervened. It was purely because they were negligent, they went off to lunch, they couldn't care less, and the injuries were caused as a direct result of their carelessness. On the other side, if there is remoteness of damage, in other words, if something else happened in the meantime, let's say they had gone off to lunch and they had secured the perimeter, they had done their duty, they had erected the safety net. While they had left the location to go home for whatever reason, someone who was very vindictive climbed up, cut away a section of the safety net, loosened a couple of the bolts or screws, and then part of the structure collapses, hits someone over the head, injures them, then that is not as a direct result of the carelessness of the company. Okay, so the company will still possibly be sued, but they will not be found to have breached their duty of care. Now, that scenario could be referred to as remoteness of damage. However, it means that the person who climbed up, cut the safety net, unscrewed the bolts, they will be guilty of the criminal offence. And if they have the money, they can also be sued. So it could have nothing to do with the scaffolding company if it's proved that someone somewhere else caused the careless or caused a careless act to create injuries. Okay. So I go back to repeat. If, however, the chain of events is broken by some independent or new intervening or new act intervening between the careless act and the injuries, then the law accepts that the damage will be too remote, otherwise called remoteness of damage. Full stop. New paragraph. An example. A woman with a heart condition was involved in a car accident which resulted in her being admitted to hospital with several injuries. Stop. During her treatment in hospital, she suffered heart failure and died. Full stop. The court can take the view that she already suffered from a heart condition and her death was not as a direct result of her car accident, but from a previous illness exacerbated by the car accident. Full stop. It might be reasonable to assume that the heart condition would have eventually resulted in her death. Okay, full stop. So here we do not have direct result. What we do have here is remoteness of damage. She had a heart condition. Having said that, she probably wouldn't have died at this point in time, but she probably eventually would have died sometime later due to her heart condition. So here we have a situation. She collided with another vehicle. She sustained injuries as a result of the accident, but she did not die as a direct result of the accident, of the collision. Let's say she didn't have a heart attack. She had an accident and she died in hospital from brain injuries sustained in the car accident. Then that is direct result. There is no remoteness of damage. The accident was the contributing factor. The accident was the direct result which caused her death. The remoteness of damage here is the fact that something intervened. Something intervened between the carelessness of the motorist and her injuries or her death. And the intervening factor is the fact that she had a previous heart condition. And while she was in hospital being treated for the injuries sustained, which probably were not life-threatening, she died as a result of her heart failing. Her heart condition caused her death. So that is the intervening act here. It's not a new act, but it's not the direct result of her death. there is in this situation what is termed remoteness of damage. And really all that this does is to make the compensation payable a little bit less, because the company is not guilty of the full extent of the injuries which caused death. Okay, the full extent meant her heart condition was made worse because of the accident. If she hadn't had the accident, it would not have probably happened at this moment. But it's fairly safe to assume from medical records obtained that her heart condition would eventually have killed her. Alright? So, one, we have direct result and carelessness, which was foreseeable. And if you prove that, it means that the company will be liable for the full extent of the injuries. Massive compensation. However, if there is remoteness of damage, if the damage was too remote, there was no direct result, there was an intervening act, then it means that the company will not be liable for the full extent, and therefore the level of compensation will simply be less. It will be reduced, but they will still be liable. Okay. New paragraph. It is for the injured party to establish causation. So new paragraph, it is for the injured party to establish causation. And causation simply means cause for action. Full stop. The burden of proof rests with the plaintiff, or in brackets claimant, depending on your province, but most of the provinces will refer to them as plaintiff. Okay, so it is for the injured party to establish causation, or to establish cause for action. The burden of proof rests with the plaintiff. So in other words, it's for the plaintiff to prove either cause for action, which means that there was a direct result of the company breaching their duty of care. It's not up to the company to prove, it's up to the claimant or the plaintiff to prove on a balance of probabilities that the company or the defendant is liable. Alright, I think we can safely have another break at this point. When we return, we shall look at the other aspect or category of tort. So what we have been concentrating on up to this point is tort against the person. When we come back, we will look at another example of tort. So see you in just a second.